The water was cold against her hand that summer morning in 1887. 7-year-old Helen Keller stood at the pump in Tuscumbia, Alabama, feeling the liquid cascade over her small fingers. But this time, something was different. This time, her teacher, Anne Sullivan, was spelling letters into her other hand. W-A-T-E-R. For years, Helen had lived in what she would later describe as a dense fog, a world without sight, without sound, without words. But in that singular moment, as the cool water flowed and the letters formed, a spark ignited in the darkness. The connection between the physical sensation and the abstract symbol suddenly blazed into understanding. Water wasn't just a feeling, it was a word. And if water had a name, then everything had a name. The fog began to lift. Helen would later write, "That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free." What happened next would not just change one girl's life, it would redefine what humanity believed was possible. To understand the magnitude of Helen Keller's achievement, we must first understand the depth of her challenge. At 19 months old, Helen contracted an illness, likely scarlet fever or meningitis, that left her both deaf and blind. In an instant, the world went silent and dark. Imagine it. No mother's lullaby, no father's face, no golden sunlight or starry nights, no bird song or thunder, no words to express hunger, pain, fear, or love. Just an endless, isolated darkness. For most of the 1880s, deaf-blind children were considered unteachable. They were often institutionalized, hidden away, written off as tragic casualties of fate. Society had drawn a line around what was possible for such individuals, and that line was very, very small. Helen's early years reflected this grim reality. Unable to communicate, she grew wild with frustration. She threw tantrums, broke dishes, and lashed out at anyone who tried to restrain her. Her family loved her, but didn't know how to reach her. She was, as her father once said, a little phantom, present in body but unreachable in spirit. The Kellers were on the verge of sending Helen to an institution when they heard about the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston. They wrote asking for help. The school sent them a young teacher named Anne Sullivan, herself partially blind, herself a survivor of poverty and hardship. Anne Sullivan arrived at the Keller home in March 1887. She was 20 years old. Helen was 6. Neither could have known they were about to embark on one of the most remarkable partnerships in human history. Anne Sullivan understood something that others didn't. Helen wasn't unteachable. She was unreached. There was a brilliant mind trapped inside that silent, dark world, desperate to break free. But first, Anne had to establish discipline. Helen had been allowed to run wild, and learning requires structure. In a controversial move, Anne insisted on isolating Helen from her family for 2 weeks, living alone with her in a small cottage on the property. There, away from her parents' pity and indulgence, Anne began the painstaking work of teaching Helen that actions had consequences, that there were rules and patterns to the world. And always, constantly, Anne spelled words into her hand. At meals, F-O-O-D. Getting dressed, D-R-E-S-S. playing with a doll. D-O-L-L. Helen learned to mimic the finger movements, but she didn't understand they were symbols representing things. They were just a game, a pattern, meaningless. Until that morning at the water pump. When understanding finally broke through, Helen was insatiable. She touched everything, demanding its name. By nightfall, she had learned 30 words. Within months, she knew hundreds. The child who had been considered unteachable was learning faster than most children with all their senses intact. But Helen didn't just want to name things. She wanted to understand them. She wanted to read, to write, to know everything about the world she couldn't see or hear. And Anne Sullivan, with infinite patience and creativity, found ways to teach her. Here's where Helen Keller's story transcends inspiration and becomes instruction. Because what Helen Keller did next wasn't just remarkable, it was revolutionary. She didn't just learn to communicate. She learned to read Braille in English, French, German, Greek, and Latin. She didn't just learn to write. She learned to type and to write in Braille, and eventually, through painstaking effort, to speak aloud despite never having heard a human voice. She didn't just get an education. She graduated from Radcliffe College, one of the most prestigious institutions in America, cum laude, becoming the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. Think about that for a moment. While her classmates could read with their eyes and hear lectures with their ears, Helen had to have every single book, every single lecture manually spelled into her hand by Anne Sullivan, letter by letter, word by word, hour after hour, day after day, for 4 years. The sheer determination required is almost incomprehensible. But Helen didn't just want personal achievement. She understood something profound. Her success wasn't just about her. It was about changing what society believed was possible for people with disabilities. It was about opening doors that had been nailed shut. In 1903, Helen published her autobiography, The Story of My Life, at age 23. It became an immediate bestseller, translated into 50 languages. Suddenly, the world was paying attention to this young woman who had overcome the unimaginable. But Helen didn't want attention for its own sake. She wanted to use her platform to change the world. She became a tireless advocate for people with disabilities, traveling to dozens of countries, giving speeches, with Anne interpreting, meeting with presidents and kings. She raised funds for the American Foundation for the Blind, helping to establish services and opportunities that hadn't existed before. She championed the rights of workers, women, and the poor. She opposed war and advocated for social justice. Helen Keller had every excuse to live a quiet, sheltered life. Instead, she chose to fight for others who couldn't fight for themselves. She once wrote, "The world is moved along not only by the mighty shoves of its heroes, but also by the aggregate of tiny pushes of each honest worker." Helen provided both, the mighty shove of her example and the tireless pushes of her advocacy. So what was it? What was the secret ingredient that allowed Helen Keller to achieve what everyone said was impossible? It wasn't just intelligence, though she was brilliant. It wasn't just determination, though she had that in abundance. It wasn't even just Anne Sullivan's teaching, though that partnership was essential. The secret was mindset. Helen Keller refused to accept the limitations that others placed on her. She refused to believe that her disabilities defined the boundaries of her life. She understood, at a fundamental level, that limitations are often not about what we can't do, but about what we haven't figured out how to do yet. Listen to her own words. No pessimist ever discovered the secret of the stars, or sailed to an uncharted land, or opened a new doorway for the human spirit. Helen was an optimist not because her life was easy, it was extraordinarily difficult, but because optimism was the only mindset that allowed for possibility. Pessimism would have kept her trapped in that dark, silent world. Optimism gave her the courage to reach for more. And she also understood that obstacles are not stop signs, they're challenges to be solved creatively.
Can't see to read? Learn Braille. Can't hear lectures? Have them spelled into your hand. Can't speak clearly? Practice for years until you can. Every obstacle had a solution if you were willing to work hard enough and think creatively enough. And perhaps most importantly, Helen understood that her life had meaning beyond herself. She wrote, "Alone we can do so little. Together we can do so much." Her achievements weren't just personal victories. They were victories for everyone who had been told they couldn't, everyone who had been underestimated, everyone who had been written off. Helen Keller lived to be 87 years old, passing away in 1968. By then, she had met every U.S. president, from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson. She had traveled to 39 countries. She had written 14 books. She had received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and been inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. But her greatest legacy isn't measured in awards or accolades. It's measured in changed minds and open doors. Because of Helen Keller, society began to see people with disabilities differently, not as objects of pity, but as individuals with potential. Because of her advocacy, laws were passed ensuring education for children with disabilities. Because of her example, countless individuals with disabilities found the courage to pursue their own dreams. The Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990, owes a debt to Helen Keller's pioneering work. Every deafblind person who receives education and support today stands on the foundation she built. Every person with a disability who refuses to accept society's limitations is walking a path she helped clear. One woman, born into darkness and silence, changed the world's understanding of human potential. Helen Keller's story isn't just history, it's a blueprint for how to live with courage and purpose in any era, facing any challenge. First, refuse to accept other people's limitations. Society will always try to tell you what you can't do, what's not possible for someone like you. Helen teaches us to question those assumptions. The only limits that truly matter are the ones we accept for ourselves. Second, find your Anne Sullivan. None of us succeed alone. Helen had a teacher who believed in her when no one else did, who worked tirelessly to help her reach her potential. Seek out mentors, teachers, friends who see your potential and push you toward it, and be that person for others. Third, turn your obstacles into your mission. Helen could have focused solely on overcoming her own challenges. Instead, she used her experience to help others. Your struggles aren't just personal, they're preparation for service. The obstacles you overcome equip you to help others overcome theirs. Fourth, cultivate relentless optimism. Not blind optimism that ignores reality, but determined optimism that believes solutions exist even when they're not yet visible. Helen lived in literal darkness, but chose to focus on light. She couldn't hear the world's noise, but chose to listen to hope. She lived in darkness, but she became a light for millions. The only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision, Helen once said.
She had no sight, but she had vision beyond measure. And that vision, that refusal to accept limits, that determination to redefine what's possible, that commitment to lifting others as you climb, that vision still lights the way forward for all of us. The water still flows, the lesson still resonates, the possibility still beckons. What will you do with your one precious life? What limits will you refuse? What possibilities will you redefine? Helen Keller answered those questions with her life. Now it's your turn to answer them with yours.